4 different categories of physical evidence, recovered from 4 different locations across more than 3 decades of excavation, all point toward the exact same conclusion about who actually built the Great Pyramid of Giza. The bones tell one part of the story, the bread tells another, the boats tell a third, and the brushstrokes, quite literally painted onto stone inside the pyramid itself, confirm everything the other 3 already suggested. Put these 4 threads together, and you get a picture of pyramid construction that has almost nothing in common with either of the 2 myths that have dominated popular imagination for generations. Not an army of suffering slaves, and not a mysterious technology gifted by visitors from beyond Earth. Let's start with the bones, because skeletal remains tend to be the most honest witnesses available to archaeology, incapable of exaggeration in either direction. When Egyptologist Zahi Hawass and his team began excavating the workers' cemetery south of the Giza pyramids, beginning with an accidental 1990 discovery when a tourist's horse stumbled over a buried wall, they found something that immediately complicated the slave narrative. These were not mass graves or hastily discarded remains. The tombs, dating precisely to Egypt's 4th dynasty, the exact period of Khufu's reign, and the Great Pyramid's construction, were built directly beside the royal pyramid complex itself, arranged with the same basic principles of careful burial preparation, reserved for honoring the dead in ancient Egyptian belief. As Hawass bluntly put it, enslaved people would not have been permitted to build tombs for themselves in the shadow of their king's monument, let alone receive burials prepared for eternity the way royalty and nobility were. The skeletal remains themselves added further detail. Researchers studying the bones found evidence consistent with the demands of intense physical labor. Exactly what you'd expect from people moving multi-ton stone blocks for a living, but they also found something that argued directly against the brutal, forced labor narrative, evidence of medical treatment. Some skeletons showed healed fractures, bones that had been set and allowed to mend rather than simply left to heal poorly or kill the worker outright. I'm suggesting the workforce had access to some form of medical care, a detail that fits far more comfortably with a valued, organized labor force than with disposable, expendable slaves. The tombs themselves contained grave goods, food offerings intended for the afterlife, and inscriptions naming more than 20 distinct job titles among the workforce, including specialized roles like artisan and overseer of the side of the pyramid, evidence of a structured professional hierarchy rather than an undifferentiated mass of forced labor. Now, the bread and the rest of the diet alongside it. Excavations of the nearby workers' settlement, a continuous old kingdom community covering roughly 3 square kilometers near the modern village of Nazlet El Salmon, uncovered bakeries complete with bread molds and ovens, breweries with beer jars, cooking pots, and grain-sifting trays used to process flour, alongside the butchered bones of cattle, pigs, and sheep, bearing clear evidence of professional butchery marks. Hawass estimated that the daily delivery of livestock to the site, drawn from farms across both northern and southern Egypt, could have fed approximately 10,000 workers on any given day. A diet substantial enough to include regular meat consumption, a genuinely valuable food source in ancient Egyptian society, generally reserved for labor the state considered important enough to properly sustain. This wasn't the bare subsistence diet of people being worked to death. It was the kind of organized food logistics operation you'd expect to support a large, valued, professionally managed workforce, complete with its own dedicated food production infrastructure built specifically to sustain it. Next, the boats, and this is where the evidence shifts from inference to direct, first-hand testimony written by someone who was actually there. When in 2013, a French archaeological team led by Pierre Tallet discovered something remarkable in man-made storage caves at an ancient Red Sea harbor called Wadi al-Jarf, roughly 150 miles from Giza. Papyrus logbooks dating to the 26th and 27th year of Khufu's reign, the oldest written papyri ever discovered in Egypt, and crucially, documents written during the actual construction of the Great Pyramid itself by people directly involved in it. The most significant of these documents, now called the Diary of Merer after the official who wrote it, recorded the daily activities of a team of roughly 40 men responsible for transporting white limestone blocks by boat from quarries at Tura to the Giza construction site, completing 2 to 3 round trips roughly every 10 days, each carrying around 30 blocks weighing 2 to 3 tons apiece, totaling approximately 200 blocks transported per month. What makes Merer's diary so decisive isn't just what it describes, but how it describes it. In the dry, procedural language of someone managing a logistics operation, tracking dates, quantities, in personnel the way any organized workforce supervisor would, including records of payment in goods, the practical form of compensation used throughout the ancient Egyptian economy. There is nothing in this document resembling the language of forced captivity. It reads exactly like what it is, the working notebook of a paid, literate professional managing skilled labor on a massive infrastructure project. Abandoned at the harbor, according to Lid archaeologist Pierre Tallet's own assessment, likely because operations stopped abruptly following Khufu's death near the very end of the period the diary covers. And finally, the brushstrokes, the most recent piece of this four-part puzzle, uncovered as recently as 2025. Hawass and his team documented red ochre inscriptions painted directly above the king's chamber inside the Great Pyramid itself, recording the names of rotating work gangs and tallying the days each team had worked. This detail matters enormously because of how closely it mirrors evidence found over a decade earlier and 150 miles away in the Wadi al-Jarf. Papyri, two entirely separate discoveries from two different locations, found more than 10 years apart by different research efforts, independently converging on the exact same picture of an organized, named rotating workforce tracked through detailed record-keeping. When two independent lines of physical evidence, recovered years apart in different places, tell the same specific story, that convergence carries real scientific weight. So, if the workers weren't slaves, how exactly did ancient Egypt assemble a labor force large enough to move millions of stone blocks? The most widely supported explanation among Egyptologists centers on a system called corvée labor, a periodic rotational levy on Egypt's general population, most plausibly scheduled around the months when the Nile's annual flood made most agricultural land temporarily unworkable, freeing up labor that would otherwise have been occupied in the fields. Within ancient Egyptian religious and political belief, the pharaoh's role in maintaining cosmic order, called Ma'at, was considered directly tied to the well-being of the entire society, meaning contributing labor toward the pharaoh's monumental afterlife preparations likely carried genuine social and religious significance for ordinary Egyptians, a far cry from the coerced, meaningless suffering the slave myth has always insisted upon. It's also worth being precise about a common point of confusion here. The biblical account of Hebrew slaves in Egypt, most familiar through the Exodus narrative, describes events most biblical chronologies place many centuries after Khufu's fourth dynasty reign, involving a different population, a different historical period, and, according to the archaeological evidence, an entirely different category of labor than what built the Great Pyramid. Now for the second myth, the one insisting this entire achievement required help from beings who weren't human. This idea entered mainstream popular culture largely through Erich von Däniken's 1968 book, Chariots of the Gods, arguing that ancient societies couldn't plausibly have achieved monuments of this scale and precision without extraterrestrial assistance. More than 50 years of subsequent archaeology has only weakened this claim further. Quarries near Aswan still contain abandoned tools and a massive, unfinished obelisk left attached to its bedrock, frozen mid-extraction, showing in direct physical detail exactly how ancient Egyptians cut and shaped enormous stone using copper chisels and wooden wedges soaked in water to split rock along natural fracture lines. Evidence of construction ramps, built from compacted rubble and mud, has been documented directly at the Giza site, addressing precisely the engineering puzzle the alien theory claims has no earthly answer. And the broader architectural record shows ancient Egyptian engineering developing incrementally and visibly over generations, from simple mastaba tombs, through Djoser's experimental step pyramid, through several earlier pyramid designs that partially failed or collapsed, before finally culminating in the precise, smooth-sided geometry of Khufu's Great Pyramid, exactly the gradual, trial and error pattern you would expect from skilled human engineers building on the accumulated knowledge of their predecessors, not a sudden, unexplained technological leap. Put all four categories of evidence together, the bones, the bread, the boats, and the brushstrokes, and a picture emerges that is considerably more impressive than either myth it replaces. This was a massive, multi-generational human achievement, carried out by an organized, fed, paid, and in at least some cases medically cared for workforce, also managing logistics on a scale that required detailed written record keeping, seasonal labor rotation, and dedicated food production infrastructure capable of feeding 10,000 people a day. The Great Pyramid did not require enslaved suffering to explain it, and it did not require alien intervention to explain it either. It required exactly what the evidence consistently shows it required: tens of thousands of ordinary people, organized with remarkable sophistication, doing something genuinely extraordinary and leaving behind, across 4,500 years and four completely different categories of physical evidence, more than enough proof of exactly how they did it. It's worth adding a fifth thread to this investigation that doesn't fit neatly into the bones, bread, boats, or brushstrokes categories, but matters enormously to understanding how this entire operation actually functioned. The question of where, geographically, this enormous workforce actually came from, and what that tells us about ancient Egyptian society more broadly. Hawass's research suggests workers were drawn from poor farming families across both northern and southern Egypt, meaning the Pyramid Project pulled labor from across the entire length of the country. Not from one isolated region or one specific social class confined to Giza itself. This detail matters because it implies a remarkably centralized administrative system, capable of recruiting, organizing, transporting, housing, and feeding workers gathered from hundreds of miles apart, rotating them on a predictable schedule and presumably returning them home again once their service period ended. Coordinating logistics at this scale, across this much geographic distance, using nothing more advanced than written records, boats, and organized administrative hierarchies, represents a genuinely impressive feat of ancient state capacity in its own right, arguably just as remarkable as the engineering of the pyramid itself, even though it rarely gets the same attention in popular retellings of this story. There's also a broader pattern worth noting about how Egyptologists' understanding of this entire question has evolved over time, because it offers a useful lesson in how good archaeology actually works. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Western popular imagination, heavily influenced by Herodotus' second-hand account, and later reinforced by biblical imagery, entirely unrelated to the actual historical period in question, simply assumed slave labor without much direct archaeological scrutiny of the claim at all. It took the patient accumulation of physical evidence, starting with that serendipitous 1990 discovery, and continuing through the 2013 Wadi el-Jarf papyri and the 2025 inscriptions above the king's chamber, to systematically test and ultimately overturn an assumption that had gone largely unquestioned for well over 2,000 years. That's not a minor academic footnote. It's a genuinely significant correction to how an entire civilization's most famous achievement gets understood and taught, accomplished entirely through careful, methodical fieldwork rather than through speculation in either direction. There's one final point worth making about the alien theory specifically, because it tends to rest on an assumption that, once examined directly, turns out to be considerably weaker than it initially sounds. The idea that the precision and scale of the Great Pyramid are simply too advanced for the tools and techniques available to ancient Egyptians. This assumption almost always relies on comparing ancient Egyptian achievement against an imagined, oversimplified picture of what Bronze Age technology and organization could plausibly accomplish, rather than against the actual well-documented archaeological record of how Egyptian engineering developed. Egyptian engineers had already been building in stone for centuries before Khufu's reign, accumulating practical knowledge about quarrying, transport, and structural stability through direct trial and error, including several earlier pyramid attempts that partially failed, providing exactly the kind of hard-won engineering lessons you'd expect to precede a culminating achievement like the Great Pyramid. Precision achieved through generations of accumulated, documented skill isn't actually mysterious. It's the normal, well-understood pattern behind nearly every major engineering achievement in human history, ancient or modern, and the Great Pyramid. Examined honestly against the full archaeological record, rather than against a flattened, simplified version of ancient capability, fits that pattern perfectly.